Victoria, it is always such a pleasure to chat with you. Last time we talked was mid-September,
I think so, yeah.
mid-September-ish. Yeah. And harvest, I know, was in full swing last time we talked. So now there's actually snow, the four-letter S word, in the air in some parts of the country. And more importantly, bins are full. So what I'm hearing is generally a good news story across the country. Is that kind of in a snapshot what you're hearing as well?
Yeah, good, pretty positive in general. Yeah, I don't know. You want me to start from east to west? Would you like to hear the full?
I certainly would. Tell me about quality. Tell me about yields. What are you hearing?
Okay.
I think, am I right in saying Stats Canada's production numbers come out early December 5th?
December 5th, yes.
You've got your own production estimates.
We have our own production estimates, which we can go through once I do the regional reports. I'll give you the overall sort of roll up into what we expect for production.
Perfect. Okay. So chat me through. Let's start out in the west because that's where I am and move towards you in the east.
There you go. So BC, well, you know what the weather was like, I guess, but so they've now completed their harvest, of course. Apparently they had about up to 7 inches of rain in the last 3 weeks. So it's been nonstop rain through harvest. So they lost some acres, not a huge number of acres, but in terms of proportion, probably close to 3% of their total planted acres, as they are, BC is a much smaller in terms of total planted acres compared to some of the other provinces. But the crop itself reported different regionally, average to above average in some areas, but definitely down from last year. But 2023 was an excellent crop for BC. So their production was, not record, but very, very good last year. So this year is definitely down, but still about 25% up from 2 years ago. So still a very good crop in BC. They're happy with it. The supply and demand is well in balance for the moment. Their demand is still good. However, we would note that there have been an influx of potatoes from the U.S. So they've been getting an influx of russet potatoes from the U.S. Of course, there's some surplus in the Pacific Northwest on the processing side, and some of that is falling into the fresh market. So we are seeing a little bit of that in BC. Alberta, the harvest just wrapped up in the last, at the end of last week, beginning of last week, I should say. And winter has definitely arrived out there already. But they did get their harvest in. They got it in well. And yields were actually better than expected, considering the weather challenges that they have been through this summer. They had hail. They've had severe rain. They've had more rain in the last 5 years. So they actually had rain in spring, which they've had near drought-like conditions for the last 3 to 5 years. So having that surplus, like that rain, in the spring was nice in terms of it was able to push off some of their irrigation. Alberta is pretty much 100% irrigated in the commercial sector down further south. Not as much in the seed. And actually the seed sector was a bit drier this year. And they're up towards the Edmonton area. And that is being reflected in the yields out of the seed sector. So not a huge crop, impacting the yields in the seed sector for Alberta. But overall, it's good. Their processing plant expansion is still on track. It's actually supposed to be up and running next June. They won't be taking any of the current 2024 crop. They'll be contracting other potatoes for that time. So, but the other processing plants are running at capacity, so things are going well from that perspective. But with that higher than expected yield in this commercial area, there is a potential for a bit of surplus in processing. So we're going to see once, they're still, taking count of their numbers, et cetera. So we'll know more in the coming weeks how that's going to shake out. Manitoba, almost done their harvest in the fresh sector. They were still working away. They've had a tough time and a slow harvest. They've had weather events like crazy as well. A lot of rain. They've had drownouts. They've lost fields early on, parts of fields. What's coming out of the field is very, very good quality. They're very happy with what's coming out of the field, but of course, less is coming out of the fresh harvest, simply due, and the rain that they got mid-September, really, really heavy rains within a 24-hour period. And part of that washed away like sort of the sides of the hills. So there's potential for greening of the potatoes, loss of nutrients during that bulking up period. And that's the same thing that part of Quebec experienced at the end of Hurricane Debbie in August. So they've had a little bit, but not all of through Quebec, just one particular region really got hit the hardest. So both of them have kind of experienced that. But so far so good, and it's just a bit of a slower harvest period for Manitoba, but they're moving through it. Inventory so far is good. Reds aren't as on the market quite as much, right through the Red River Valley, even south of the border, same sort of conditions. Yellow inventory across Canada really is plentiful. Red inventory is fairly tight, but we can get more into that when we talk about the pricing and sort of market supply and demand. Ontario and Quebec, good harvest, good growing season, especially when you compare it to last year and the consistent rainfall that Quebec experienced all growing season. Ontario as well. Late blight, there were a couple of cases in both provinces, but caught very early, very quickly, completely contained, not an issue like it was last year. So that's a great thing. So both of them, as of end of last week, were 98, 99% done of their harvest. So things are wrapping up. The early crop has pretty much moved out. So those early white potatoes in particular, yellows, are wrapping up. And the early white inventory is actually fairly tight. It's gone quite quickly this year. Good demand on that, and things have moved. So their harvest went well, and the crop's coming out well. Yields are average to above average. And New Brunswick and PEI, New Brunswick would be closer to Quebec weather. They've had, again, when you compare it to last year, night and day. The issues of hollow heart and rot that were experienced in New Brunswick created really a shortage of processing potatoes, in particular in New Brunswick. There were a lot of potatoes moving west to east to fill that shortage. That won't be happening this year. They've had a great crop, very good harvest, quality is excellent. So they're very, very happy with what's been coming out of the ground this year. And PEI was an interesting story. They planted early, planting season went very, very well. The growing season up until probably July was one of the best crops they've ever seen. And then August, it just dried up, literally. So with next to no precipitation through August and September, it really kind of changed things a lot in terms of the yield. So it really took the top off the yields in PEI. What they're seeing for harvest, it's actually wrapping up a little bit earlier. Sometimes PEI can go right through till Halloween and a little bit beyond. So they've actually wrapped up a little bit earlier. They did get some recent rains, as kind of timely rains through harvest, which kind of helped things along there, and harvest weather was pretty good. But the quality that they're getting out, they're very, very happy with. So it's just the yield and size profile will be a little bit different than what it was last year. But in terms of the quality and what they're getting out, they're super happy. So all in all, like you said, harvest overall was really positive when you compare, especially when you compare it to last year. Quebec and Ontario had rain all season and then a good harvest. PEI had good growing season and then rain all through harvest. Manitoba was just all over the map, and BC and Alberta were droughts, and same with Saskatchewan. And this year it's just completely flipped. So people are generally pretty happy with what's happened this year.
A generally good news story.
Yeah.
So let's talk pricing.
Yeah.
You started to talk about pricing when you were talking about Manitoba.
Yeah.
What are we seeing? I mean, compared to last year's massive crop,
yeah,
having a little bit more moderate sized crop is actually a good thing for pricing.
Yes, it does. When you balance out that supply and demand, of course, that helps stabilize pricing. In terms of, as I was mentioning, for the colors, whites, yellows, reds, Reds and whites are actually fairly tight this year, and that's a continual decline in planted acreage for red potatoes throughout North America. That's not just a Canadian thing. That's also a switch that we've seen in the U.S. And it's basically switched over to yellow potatoes, which have had a good demand, and the yield is so much better. So when you plant extra acres, not only do you get those extra potatoes, you also get the double from the higher yield of the yellow varieties. So there have been a lot of questions in the last year or two. Have we hit that plateau? Have we hit the pinnacle for yellow? And some people are really starting to talk about that maybe we need to stabilize our yellow acreage to avoid any slowdown in demand or impact on pricing, because inventory is a little more abundant than normal. The russet situation, Pacific Northwest, in particular, Idaho, definitely not the surplus that they had last year, but still will most likely be in a surplus position. Part of that's to do with Lamb Weston, one of the big processors. They're publicly traded, so I can kind of talk about what's happening with them. They have closed a plant in Washington and have really reduced production in a number of their plants. So that is, of course, reducing the uptake of raw potatoes for their production. And they are doing a buyback for contracted potatoes. So those potatoes can end up in the fresh sector. There were rumors that some of that happened in Idaho, but most of it is supposed to be disposed of outside of human consumption, so cattle field or being dissed under or disposed of. But that, at the end of the day, that impacts pricing when you have a surplus. The other thing that's happening in the U.S. is the USDA does what they call a Section 32 buyback. So if they see a surplus in a vegetable or fruit, they'll go out and on bid and allow people to offer potatoes to be purchased. And then they just, put them into the food banks and the food network. And they decided to do that for potatoes early on from the 2023 huge surplus. The problem is that by the time they got to actually purchasing those potatoes, we were getting into the new crop. And the early new crop of russets was a much smaller profile. Larger profile. So as they're running to try and fill these consumer bags for this buyback, they're generating all these larger size potatoes for cartons. And what happens is that ends up impacting the carton market. So we've seen some very competitive pricing on cartons, which are going into the food service industry for the most part. So that there has been an impact there for the russet carton market. And we've seen it as far east as Montreal in terms of offers from out in the Pacific Northwest into the Quebec market very inexpensively. So, yep, there's definitely an impact. We're much better balanced in Canada as we were last year. The fresh market this year, while being up in terms of yields and harvest compared to last year, still in fairly good balance when you compare it to what they're going through in the US. So we'll see how that pans out. And it's really only yellows are abundant, but people aren't concerned yet. I mean, we'll see what comes out of storage, as you had, we've talked about in previous interviews in terms of how things can hold up in storage. So yellows can, have their issues in storage. So nobody's really in a panic yet or anything. There's nothing to panic about. It's not this immense surplus, just more abundant in terms of inventory. And we'll see where the russet's going. They're feeling now that the storage crop is coming in, they'll be able to better blend sizing and sort of stabilize that carton market a little bit. So things should stabilize a bit more in terms of pricing in the next month or so, but we'll see how that goes. And the draw, we've got the American Thanksgiving coming up, and then of course Christmas holidays. So the draw on potatoes will be good, should be good in the next month or two. So
perfect. Okay. Now, just to kind of follow up, you touched on Washington and Idaho there. One of the, producers are always going to be interested in what's happening across our country, but probably the single most common question is what's happening in Idaho. So what was the season like? What was harvest like in Idaho?
Yeah, and I'll start with Columbia Basin. You mentioned Washington. So Washington, Oregon is sort of what we put together as the Columbia Basin, and they had an excellent crop. Very good yields, very good quality, plenty of potatoes around. So we'll see how that goes. Now they're really dedicated to the processing market. They have a very, very small fresh side of things. So we'll see how that moves through the process. They are, of course, as I mentioned, being impacted by that Lamb Weston plant closure, which was in Connell, Washington. So we'll see how that pans out moving forward. And then Idaho, they've had a decent crop considering, again, what they've been through. Very, very high temperatures. They went from a late frost in June to hailstorms in July, and then serious heat in August. So surprisingly, the quality is actually pretty good overall, especially on yellows. Some have seen a bit of skinning on reds. That's a kind of, I've heard that in a couple of places actually through the US and even in Canada a little bit. And I guess that's probably more Wisconsin than it is Idaho, but Idaho is more and more into yellows and reds. We always think of them as the russet Idaho potato, but they've increased their production on reds and yellows, and that inventory is there, but not to the extent that, say, Red River Valley would be into reds or stuff like that in Minnesota. But yeah, their harvest is good, and everybody's sort of excited to see where their numbers are going to come out. There's two different reports on terms of their planted acreage. It's down from last year. One report only down maybe 10,000 acres, another report maybe down 30,000 acres. So neither of those is probably enough to balance supply and demand, but Idaho has a tendency to plant what they call flex pile potatoes, which could go either into fresh or into processing. So those potatoes are always floating around as well in the russet market. So we'll see where that goes.
Excellent. Okay. So pull out your crystal ball for me.
Yeah.
What are we seeing coming up? I guess two questions. One on the storage season ahead. PEI obviously had some stressed spuds going into storage, so more challenges through storage. So let's start there. What are you expecting for storage season ahead?
You brought up a very good point, and I would say that's across Canada and across North America. We had unseasonably warm temperatures through harvest, through September right into the beginning of October. So spuds are going into storage a little warmer than some people would like. Not everybody had the time to cool them down before getting them into storage. And people were waiting as long as they could to actually, pull those potatoes and put them into storage, waiting for pulp temperatures to go down. So, yes, people are on their toes and really keeping an eye on what that will happen in storage. I think, the benefit maybe more in the US because certain places like Wisconsin have a much smaller crop. Their storages are not as full. They were up to the rafters last year. We're kind of the opposite in Canada. Our storages are more full than they were last year. And again, that, also has an impact. So you've got more, fuller storages going in warmer. So there definitely is some concern of what could be happening. Pressure bruising and other types of storage issues that could happen through the winter. Not the rot or the hollow heart and those issues that we had last year. Definitely not, because it just wasn't as wet anywhere, especially through harvest. So I think those concerns are off growers' minds, but they definitely have other things that they're keeping an eye on this
year. For sure, and just a flag and a reminder to keep a close eye on shits.
Yeah, exactly. And it goes to what's happening in the industry with, people like NAPSO starting things up and getting growers to think about the step beyond harvest. Once it's in the bin, we forget about it. Well, no, there's a lot of things that can be happening, and being able to share those best practices among growers across the country, to make sure that, you've done all the work to get that crop in the bin, how to best take care of it, following that post-harvest. So it's definitely a good
Okay.
thing.
And second half of this crystal ball question is, what are we expecting in terms of market outlook?
Right. Well, overall, I mentioned the overall production. I mean, these are only our estimates. We at United feel we're probably going to be at about 125.4 million hundredweight this year of potatoes. That's down from the 128 of last year, but still a record crop for Canada. It's the second largest after last year. So it's still an excellent crop. And the reductions, a lot of what you're seeing in terms of the reduction were the reduced acreage in processing sector in both Manitoba and Alberta. After the surpluses last year, contract potatoes were reduced, contracted acreage was reduced. So most of that is coming from the West, and the processing sector. The fresh sector is very well in balance. Seed sector could be tight again. There were certain areas in northern Quebec that were infected by dryness, as well as Edmonton affected by dryness. So we'll see. Saskatchewan is telling me average crop. So we'll see where the seed sector as well comes out in terms of production. But I think they would be fairly flat in terms of overall production. And any specific questions on the market outlook or where we're going to be, or is that?
I think you've done a great job of providing a summary across the country and down into the States as well. And of course, everybody wants to know exactly what kind of dollars are going to end up in their pockets. Right. But that sort of rolls out as the season progresses.
Right, exactly. And I think it's really keeping us up, we need to keep up to date every month on what is happening with the potato pile. Understanding, for example, like we talked about, red inventory on red potatoes is very tight. Red River Valley is slow coming into the market. Minnesota, has had some issues. Wisconsin, having some issues. So if you've got good quality reds, make sure you're getting well paid for those. Same for whites. In Eastern Canada, round whites are, the inventory is tighter, and make sure you understand and make good decisions about the crop that you do have. So, I think understanding those dynamics and how well the crop is moving, how well it's storing is important to keep updating each month and talking about it.
Yeah.
Among the different provinces, so that we share what's happening and understand what's happening with the potato pile, how well it's moving, and allowing growers to make those good decisions about their crop.
For sure. And I think that was exactly your and my thinking when we first chatted about doing a monthly video chat like this. We've done quarterly updates in our print and online editions for a long time. But the world is very dynamic these days, and producers need at their fingertips information, and you are a wealth of knowledge. So I'm delighted to start this series with you and connect with you on a monthly basis. I just think it's going to be of huge value to producers going forward. So thank you for making time to chat. Let me throw one more at you, just because it is in line with you being so well connected in the industry. Tell me about any, if there was sort of a key event that you think that producers should have in their calendars, or something that they might not know about. Is there something on your calendar that you draw producers' eyes towards?
Yes, and absolutely. As harvest winds up, it's sort of the time most people start meetings and conferences. So there is a lot coming up in November.
Yes.
I mentioned earlier NAPSO, which is the North American Potato Storage Organization, newly started this year and have really come a long way in a very short amount of time. They're doing a webinar on November 4th, which I think is an great timing in terms of allowing people to talk about storage and ask questions and find out a little bit more about some of the best practices. So that's really important. And then there's a lot going on at the end of November. Potato Growers of Alberta, of course, have their conference, which is always an excellent conference to attend. They have such great speakers and a lot going on. So that's an excellent one to attend. And Quebec and PEI have meetings and conferences as well. It's all happening sort of that week. It's a very busy week that week at the end of November. So some important things, and hopefully the growers will have the time and ability to get out and meet with other growers and meet with other people within the industry and see what's out there and ask questions, find out new things, get good information. I think those are kind of some exciting events. And then the next big one, of course, in North America is Potato Expo in January down in Orlando. Always the biggest potato specific event of North America. So that's always a pretty exciting. We'll actually be having a joint booth again this year with our colleagues, United Potato Growers of America. So feel free, anybody who's down at Potato Expo, to come and stop by and say hello and have a seat and a chat. We'd love to have you at our booth. And so there's a lot of exciting conferences and things happening. Manitoba Potato Production Days comes right after Potato Expo. An amazing event with so much equipment out there. Really a great event to get to. So definitely a lot happening in the next 2 or 3 months.
Absolutely. And we always try to reinforce that message that the networking, the speaking with one coming together to collaborate and speak with one voice, the learning opportunities, just because it's cold out does not mean it is time to sit back. Yeah. It's just a different kind of work, and it's critically important.
Yeah, absolutely.
Victoria, as always, thank you. Super appreciate your knowledge and expertise. We will do this again next month.
Sounds great. Thank you so much.